Eddie Tippett, step away from the workstation and keep your hands visible for me.
What's this about?
Eddie Raymond Tipton operated without oversight for nearly a decade as the information security director of a multi-state lottery association trusted by millions. The man paid to protect the fairness of the game was quietly rigging it for himself.
We're reviewing access activity involving the lottery draw systems.
I've worked with those systems for years. That's my job.
He would not get the chance to explain. Within 48 hours, investigators in 3 different states would be pulling forensic images of MUSL servers, hunting for a piece of code that was designed to vanish the moment it finished its job. 7 tickets, 5 states, more than $24 million in rigged jackpots. The man hired to protect the integrity of nearly 3 dozen state lotteries had spent a decade quietly selling the only thing his employer had to sell: the outcome. Quick question before we get into it. Have you ever bought a lottery ticket and trusted, without thinking about it, that the drawing was actually random? Tell me in the comments whether you still trust it after this one. Subscribe if you want to see how a single insider can break an entire industry. We do this every week. Eddie Raymond Tipton was born in 1962 in a small town in East Texas, the older of 2 brothers in a working-class family that valued quiet competence over flash. His father worked long hours at a small machine shop. His mother kept the household running on a tight budget. Eddie and his younger brother, Tommy, grew up in neighborhoods where neighbors knew each other by car and by porch light, where the lottery was something old men talked about at the gas station counter, and where almost nobody actually won. He was the smart one. Teachers used the word constantly. He took apart radios when he was 9. He rewired a broken record player at 12. By the time he reached high school in the late 1970s, he was the kid the shop teacher asked for help when the projector would not load. He scored well on the state achievement tests. He did not, however, look or sound like the kid who would go on to engineer one of the most sophisticated insider frauds in American gaming history. He was quiet. He stuttered slightly when he was nervous. He spent lunch periods in the school library reading manuals for hardware he could not yet afford. After high school, he drifted toward computers the way other young men in his town drifted toward trucks and factory work. He took classes at a community college in Houston. He picked up freelance gigs configuring office networks for small businesses. He learned that he had a particular gift for the kind of programming nobody else wanted to do: the unglamorous low-level work that touched random number generation, security keys, and operating system internals. While other programmers chased flashy web jobs in the late 1990s, Eddie was reading academic papers on pseudo-random number generators and cryptographic seeds. He understood, at a depth most of his peers did not, exactly how a computer pretends to be random. In 2003, he moved to Iowa. The job was with the Multi-State Lottery Association, known inside the gaming industry simply as MUSL, headquartered in a low brick office building in Urbandale, just outside Des Moines. MUSL is not itself a lottery. It is the central technical organization that operates Powerball, Hot Lotto, and a portfolio of smaller multi-state games on behalf of member lotteries in dozens of states and territories. Its servers do the math. Its protocols define how draws are conducted. Its information security team is the firewall standing between the public's trust and any insider who might want to corrupt the games. Eddie Tipton was that team. He started as an information security analyst, but his rise was rapid and unremarkable to the people around him. By 2006, he was the information security director. The job came with a corner desk, a salary in the low 6 figures, full access to the random number generation source code, and physical access to the secure draw room where the random number generators themselves lived. He bought a modest split-level house in Norwalk, a suburb south of Des Moines, and lived alone. Colleagues described him as polite, deferential, and so technically dominant that nobody on the small MUSL team understood his work well enough to second-guess it. His performance reviews from those early years used the same language year after year: detail-oriented, reliable under pressure, demonstrates exceptional ownership of mission-critical systems, A 2007 evaluation called him indispensable to the integrity function. A 2009 review added that he consistently exceeds expectations in safeguarding draw operations. Auditors from the state of Iowa visited annually and signed off on his procedures. Outside auditors from MUSL's national accounting firm signed off on his procedures. Nobody, in over a decade of formal reviews, ever wrote a word suggesting that the man being trusted to protect the integrity of the games might be the single greatest threat to that integrity. He cultivated the image carefully. He drove a used SUV. He brought sack lunches to the office. He took his vacation days in modest one-week chunks, usually to visit his brother Tommy in Texas. He did not live above his obvious means, and he did not need to. The money he was about to make would not be spent on cars or houses. It would be passed quietly through other hands, in other states, on tickets he himself would never sign. To understand what Eddie Tipton did, you have to understand what MUSL actually was, and how a modern computerized lottery drawing is supposed to work. When most Americans think of a lottery drawing, they picture the televised event. Numbered ping-pong balls bouncing inside a transparent air blower, a host in a suit, an auditor in the corner. That picture is accurate for some games, but it has been progressively replaced over the last 2 decades by something called a random number generator draw, abbreviated RNG. An RNG draw uses a dedicated hardened computer to produce the winning numbers algorithmically. The computer is air-gapped from the internet. It lives behind a steel door with biometric locks. Its activity is recorded on tamper-evident video. The room itself is supposed to be entered only in pairs, with both individuals signing in, signing out, and never being alone with the equipment. By the mid-2000s, several state lotteries had moved their smaller daily and pick-style games to RNG draws, and MUSL operated the underlying systems for several of them, including Hot Lotto, which was offered in 15 states. The premise of an RNG draw is simple. It must be mathematically unpredictable to every human being on Earth, including the people who built and maintain it. The integrity of every state lottery using that system depends on that single sentence being true. MUSL had layered protections specifically to enforce it. The RNG software was supposed to be reviewed by an outside testing laboratory. The compiled code on the production machine was supposed to be hashed and verified against the audited source. Physical access was supposed to be dual-controlled. Video cameras were supposed to record every entry. The Information Security Director was supposed to oversee all of it. The Information Security Director was Eddie Tipton. The vulnerabilities were not, technically speaking, secret. Anyone who studied gaming security knew them. The cameras in MUSL's draw room had a known limitation. They recorded at 1 frame per second, which meant a person standing very still could pass through the field of view as a smear of motion, or, in some lighting conditions, not register on the recorded video at all. The dual control entry policy depended on login honesty, and the login system was administered by, again, the Information Security Director. The hash verification of production code depended on the assumption that the person performing the hash had no reason to falsify it, and the audited source code on file with the testing laboratory was, of course, the source code that Eddie had submitted. He had built the henhouse. He had written the rules for the henhouse. He had been hired to guard the henhouse, and he had personally installed every lock. The operation began, as far as investigators were eventually able to reconstruct, in November of 2005. That was the month Eddie Tipton walked into the MUSL draw room in Urbandale carrying a USB drive in his shirt pocket. The dual control policy required a second employee to be present. The second employee was a colleague Eddie outranked, who trusted him completely, and who left the room briefly to take a phone call. The cameras, recording at 1 frame per second, captured Eddie standing in front of the random number generator console for approximately 40 seconds. The recorded footage showed him, but only barely, and the activity log on the machine showed only a routine maintenance check-in by the Information Security Director. What he had actually done was load a single file onto the RNG computer. The file was a piece of code investigators would later call a rootkit, though calling it a rootkit understates the precision of the work. It was a self-deleting module that hooked into the random number generation routine. On the vast majority of dates, it did nothing at all. It sat dormant. The RNG continued to produce statistically random numbers. The lottery continued to operate as expected, and the auditors continued to find nothing wrong. But on a small handful of specific calendar dates, dates that Eddie had hard-coded into the module, the code activated. On those dates, the RNG no longer drew from the true random pool. Instead, it pulled from a predetermined, predictable subset Eddie could calculate in advance using a separate equation he kept on his own personal computer. After the draw was complete, the module did the thing that made it unforgivable. It erased itself. By the time auditors arrived for the next routine inspection, the production code on the machine matched the audited source. The hash verification passed. The code that had rigged the draw no longer existed on the system. He did not buy the tickets himself. He could not. As the Information Security Director of MUSL, he was legally barred from claiming any prize from any game his organization operated. He understood from the beginning that the buyer chain had to be other people, in other states, with no visible connection to him. The first person he brought into it was his brother, Tommy Tipton, who lived in Texas and worked as a justice of the peace. The exact moment of recruitment never made it into the trial record, but the financial pattern did. On December 23, 2005, in a gas station in Sugar Land, Texas, a man matching Tommy Tipton's description bought a winning Colorado Lotto ticket. The numbers had been drawn on November 23, 2005, 1 month after Eddie's first known visit to the draw room. The prize was $568,990. The winner walked into the Colorado Lottery office, claimed the money, and disappeared. For 2 years, the operation went quiet. Investigators later concluded this was deliberate. Eddie was learning the system, refining the code, and watching to see whether the December 2005 draw triggered any internal alarm. It did not. In December 2007, the second hit landed. A Wisconsin Megabucks ticket worth $783,257 was claimed by a man named Robert Rhodes, a longtime friend of Eddie's from his earlier days in Texas. Rhodes was a Houston businessman with a clean record, no obvious connection to lottery operations, and a plausible reason to occasionally pass through Wisconsin. The ticket was paid out without incident. The pattern accelerated. December 2007 in Kansas, November 2011 in Oklahoma. In each case, the winning ticket was bought in a state where Eddie himself had no documented presence, on a draw date that Eddie had quietly engineered, by a friend or relative who claimed the prize through standard channels. The dollar amounts grew, so did the audacity. By 2010, Eddie was not only predicting numbers, but also picking draw dates that would produce the largest possible rolled-over jackpots. Inside MUSL, there were tiny signs that nobody assembled into a pattern. A colleague noticed that Eddie sometimes worked late on Wednesdays, the night before Hot Lotto draws. A junior analyst found it odd that Eddie had personally rewritten the RNG initialization routine, which was specialized work that fell outside his normal duties. A draw room sign-in sheet from 2009 listed Eddie entering alone for a system check that did not appear on the IT department's official ticket queue. None of these observations were ever escalated. Eddie was the Information Security Director. Every protocol question routed through him for review. He kept his lifestyle modest. The money flowed elsewhere, into property purchases in Texas, into business investments by Robert Rhodes, into accounts maintained by Tommy and others. Eddie himself drove the same used SUV, lived in the same Norwalk split level, and ate the same sack lunches at his MUSL desk. He understood that the moment he visibly enriched himself, the entire operation would unravel. We are heading into the part where it all comes apart. If you have made it this far, you already know this case is different from the usual stick-up at a gas station. Subscribe. We break down white-collar insider cases like this every single week, and the next one we are publishing is somehow even more brazen. It ended because of a single ticket, not because the code was discovered, not because an auditor finally cracked the hash. The whole thing fell apart because of a $16.5 million Hot Lotto jackpot, an anonymous claimant, and an Iowa lottery director who refused to be hurried. The drawing was held on December 29, 2010. The winning ticket had been purchased on December 23rd at a Quick Trip convenience store on Northwest 86th Street in Urbandale, Iowa, less than 2 miles from the MUSL office where Eddie Tipton worked. For nearly a year, the ticket went unclaimed. Lottery officials grew quietly puzzled. A $16.5 million prize does not normally sit unclaimed. The store's surveillance footage was preserved as a matter of routine, though nobody at that point had any reason to study it carefully. On November 9, 2011, one day before the one-year claim deadline expired, a New York attorney named Crawford Shaw walked into the Iowa Lottery headquarters in Clive and attempted to claim the prize on behalf of a Belize-registered trust called Hexam Investments. The lottery official who took the meeting, an executive named Terry Rich, listened to the attorney's explanation and felt, in his own later words, something off about every part of it. State law required the lottery to know the identity of the actual winner. The attorney refused to provide that name, citing trust confidentiality. Terry Rich did not refuse the claim outright. He simply asked for the information again and again. The deadline passed. The attorney withdrew the claim. The $16.5 million was placed back into the prize fund, and the surveillance video from the Quick Trip on Northwest 86th Street suddenly became the most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. The video had been recorded on December 23, 2010. It showed a heavy-set man in a hooded sweatshirt walking into the store, buying the ticket, and leaving. The image was grainy. The face was partially obscured. But the build was distinctive. So was the voice on the audio track, captured as the man asked for the ticket. Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation released the footage to local media in October 2014, and they did the one thing investigators had been hoping for. They asked the public to identify the man. A MUSL employee saw the broadcast. The employee was not in IT. The employee did not work directly under Eddie Tipton, but the employee had attended enough company gatherings to recognize the build, the gait, and most of all, the voice. The employee called Iowa investigators the next morning and said the name out loud: Eddie Tipton. The investigation that followed was led by Special Agent Don Smith of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, working in coordination with the Iowa Attorney General's office, and, eventually, with investigators from Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin. It took 2 years to assemble. The first step was the simplest and the most damaging. They asked MUSL for permission to examine the RNG computer. The forensic image of the production machine, taken on a quiet morning in early 2015, returned exactly what Eddie had engineered it to return. There was no rootkit. There was no malicious module. The production code was clean, the hash matched the audited source, and a casual review would have closed the case as a misidentification. But investigators had also requested, and received, a forensic image of an older RNG computer that had been retired and placed in storage years earlier. That machine, no longer in active use, had not been wiped according to the same standards. On its drive, in a partially overwritten sector, forensic analysts at the Iowa DCI lab recovered fragments of code. The fragments were small. They were not the whole module, but they were enough to confirm that something had once been written to that machine that should not have been there. 2 of the fragments contained date comparison logic. One contained a routine for overwriting itself and removing its own file system entry. Another referenced a calendar of specific dates, including December 29, 2010, the night of the 16th. $5 million Hot Lotto draw. The investigation widened. Texas authorities re-examined the 2005 Colorado Lotto claim by Tommy Tipton and discovered, in his old financial records, a cash deposit pattern that did not match a single sudden lottery win, but a gradual, deliberate distribution of funds. Wisconsin authorities re-examined Robert Rhodes' 2007 Megabucks claim. Kansas and Oklahoma re-examined their own files. In each case, the buyer had a relationship to Eddie Tipton that nobody had previously thought to map. The phone records came next. investigators pulled cellular metadata for Eddie's personal phone, his brother Tommy's phone, and Robert Rhodes's phone, going back as far as the carrier's retained records. The pattern was unmistakable. In the days before each anomalous drawing, the three men had spoken to each other repeatedly. In the days after each anomalous drawing, the calls dropped to nothing. The communication was operational, not social. Then there was the personal computer. When the search warrant was finally executed at Eddie's house in Norwalk on March 25, 2015, investigators recovered a laptop he had not used in years. On it, buried in a folder labeled Personal, they found drafts of the very equation he had used to predict winning numbers. They also found notes in his own handwriting, on a yellow legal pad in his desk drawer, listing dates and corresponding numerical strings. The dates matched the rigged drawings. The strings matched the winning combinations. In total, investigators linked Eddie Tipton to at least 7 winning tickets across 5 states: Colorado, Wisconsin, Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa. The total face value of the rigged jackpots exceeded $24 million, though the actual payouts, after taxes and lump sum reductions, were substantially less. Tommy Tipton was charged separately in Texas. Robert Rhodes was charged separately in Wisconsin. The Hot Lotto game, the flagship multi-state game whose December 2010 jackpot had triggered the whole collapse, was killed off by MUSL in October 2017, 2 months after Eddie's sentencing. The brand was considered unsalvageable. The smoking gun, in the end, was not the recovered code fragments, though those were technically the most damning evidence. It was the legal pad in the desk drawer. Eddie had built a piece of software designed to delete itself, to leave no record, to make the impossible undetectable. And then he had written the numbers down on paper, in his own hand, in a drawer in his own house. The man who understood digital forensics better than almost anyone in his industry had been undone by ink. The arrest came on January 15, 2015, when investigators charged Eddie with 2 felony counts of fraud related to the Hot Lotto ticket. He was not handcuffed dramatically. He was not perp-walked. He was asked to come to the Iowa DCI office in Des Moines for what was described to him as a clarifying interview. He came willingly. He sat in a small room across a metal table from Special Agent Don Smith and a second investigator named Matthew Anderson. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. For the first 90 minutes, Eddie was conversational. He answered routine questions about his work history at MUSL. He described the architecture of the RNG draw system in such technical detail that Anderson eventually asked him to slow down. He acknowledged that he had been in the draw room on the dates investigators raised. He attributed it to ordinary maintenance. Then Agent Smith placed the quick trip surveillance still on the table. Eddie, we need you to tell us about December 23, 2010. Eddie looked at the photograph for a long moment. The image showed the heavy-set man in the hooded sweatshirt at the counter. Eddie did not deny it was him. He did not confirm it was him. I do not recall being in that store. You do not recall, or you were not there? I do not recall. Smith placed a second item on the table. A printed page from the legal pad recovered in the search of Eddie's house, with the December 29, 2010 entry circled in red. Can you explain this? Eddie looked at his own handwriting. His shoulders dropped half an inch. He did not answer immediately. He turned the page over, then back. Finally, he spoke. I would like to speak to an attorney. The interview ended. Eddie was charged. He was released on bond the same afternoon. The investigation continued for another 2 years before the final plea agreement was reached. He did not give a single public statement during that time. Eddie Raymond Tipton pleaded guilty on June 29, 2017, to a single count of ongoing criminal conduct under Iowa law. The plea covered 7 rigged tickets across 5 states. A money laundering charge was dropped as part of the agreement. His brother Tommy Tipton had already pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding. Robert Rhodes had already pleaded guilty in Wisconsin. The conspiracy, 12 years after its first known act, was formally closed. The sentencing hearing was held on August 22, 2017, in Polk County District Court in Des Moines. Judge Brad McCall presided. The courtroom was full. Reporters from the Des Moines Register, the Associated Press, and 3 national outlets sat in the front rows. Officials from the Iowa Lottery, the Colorado Lottery, and MUSL itself sat in the gallery. Several of them had worked alongside Eddie for years. None of them spoke to him. The state's lead prosecutor, Assistant Attorney General Rob Sand, read aloud from a sentencing memorandum that ran more than 30 pages. He described the technical sophistication of the scheme. He described its duration. He described the calculated, methodical way Eddie had exploited every single protection his employer had given him to exploit. He requested the statutory maximum. Eddie's defense attorney argued for leniency on the grounds that no money had been personally recovered from Eddie, that Eddie had cooperated in the final months of the investigation, and that Eddie's elderly mother in Texas depended on him. The judge listened. He read aloud from a victim impact statement submitted by Terry Rich, the Iowa Lottery executive who had refused to pay out the original $16.5 million claim. The greatest harm Mr. Tipton inflicted was not financial, Rich wrote. It was the destruction of public confidence in a system that millions of ordinary people had every right to believe was fair. A grandmother in Cedar Rapids buying a $2 ticket on her way home from work deserved to believe that her ticket had the same chance as any other. Mr. Tipton stole that belief from her. Money can be repaid. That cannot. Judge McCall set the memorandum down. He addressed Eddie directly. Mr. Tipton, you were given a position of extraordinary public trust. You were paid to be the conscience of a multi-state system. You did not betray that trust in a moment of weakness or under financial duress. You betrayed it deliberately, methodically, and for more than a decade. You designed your fraud to be undetectable, and you nearly succeeded. The court finds that the maximum sentence is warranted not for vengeance, but for deterrence, and for the message it sends to every person who sits where you sat. The sentence was the statutory maximum, up to 25 years in prison, with restitution of approximately $2.2 million, including $1.1 million owed to the Colorado Lottery. Eddie was remanded into custody immediately. He was transferred to the Iowa State Penitentiary System, eventually placed in a facility that housed a small population of white-collar offenders. He worked in the prison library. He filed no public appeals. He did not give interviews. The Hot Lotto game, the centerpiece of his decade-long fraud, was retired by MUSL on October 28, 2017. The 15 state lotteries that had carried the game replaced it with new multi-state products under tighter drawroom protocols, with independent third-party RNG audits, dual-key cryptographic verification, and continuous frame-rate video recording in every secure facility. The industry had been reshaped, at considerable expense, around the single proof that one insider could break it. Eddie's parole came faster than the public expected. In the spring of 2022, after serving roughly 4.5 years of his sentence, he was released under supervision. The restitution remained outstanding. The Iowa Attorney General's office indicated that collection efforts would continue for the rest of his life. He returned quietly to a small residence in central Iowa. Neighbors reported that he kept to himself. The man who had been hired to protect the integrity of nearly 36 state lotteries had broken every one of them at the same time, from inside the same brick building in Urbandale, with a piece of code that he himself had designed to disappear. The code disappeared. The damage did not. And the next time you buy a lottery ticket at a gas station counter, somewhere in the back of every regulator's mind, is the name of the man who proved that the only thing standing between a fair drawing and a rigged one was a single human being. That case was calculated. But the next one on your screen right now is something else entirely. Click it. You will not see it coming.